Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For 29 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. The U.S.'s dominant economic system has persisted for a very long time. Many people have assumed that the status quo must always exist, but growing numbers of people are pointing out problems such as the declining middle class, the widening gap between the very rich and everybody else, big business's abuse of our environment and climate, and the reckless and sometimes illegal wheeling dealing of Wall Street's biggest banks that crashed our economy in 2008, but instead of being held accountable and instead of being prosecuted for their crimes, the government treated these giant banks as too big to fail, so they were bailed out, and now they're even bigger. More and more people are pointing out these problems and demanding economic reforms that will stop concentrating wealth and political power in a very few rich hands, and instead serve ordinary people. The shift in public opinion is further illustrated by widespread public support for candidates who are raising these issues. In Seattle, a socialist woman was elected and re-elected as a socialist. And at the national level, we have a presidential candidate who says he is a socialist and is getting widespread support. This organization is strictly not partisan at all, but we do educate people about issues, and we encourage a vigorous public dialogue about the things that really matter, especially things that might give better alternatives than the status quo. So this month we're exploring understanding socialism, and I'm happy that we have two guests that I know and respect who have thought this through and done a lot of good work about the topic. Peter Bohmer and John Regan have studied economics for many years, and they've worked in a number of ways to lift up alternatives that will better serve the broad public interest. I'm happy to have you both here. This will be fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for being a guest. A lot of politicians and mainstream news media keep telling us that the economy is doing well after that crash, and the jobs are increasing, and everything is all hunky-dory. But that's not what ordinary people are experiencing. Ordinary people aren't working, many of them not working at the same level that they were before. They're at either lower wages or unable to get a job. And a lot of younger people have never been able to start their careers or never been able to get a livable wage. So John, I wonder if you can give us some insights into why there's such disparity, such a disconnect between what the politicians and mainstream media tell us versus what real people actually experience.
Well, I think the politicians are looking at the big picture. And the big picture is that the numbers look pretty good. Incomes are back to the levels that they were prior to 2008. Home prices are rising, and inflation is completely under control. The problem is that the extremes between what's really good and what's really bad have grown dramatically. Currently, about 28% of the population have a negative net worth. That means that they owe more money than they have in assets. We see tremendous problems throughout the economy that are not being addressed. We have the residual problems of an industrialized economy that has found only service jobs for people that were displaced by the exportation of our industries.
Mm-hmm. You have actually a story of your own with a pharmaceutical prescription. Can you tell us that story?
Well, I brought this here today because it kind of indicates the direction that capitalism is going in, and that is that profit is not simply made in production and distribution, but increasingly it's intellectual property that has a value that goes well beyond simply research and manufacturing
So
of a product.
intellectual property would be things like patents, copyrights,
Correct.
Works of audio-visual arts,
Right,
mass entertainment.
and what they do is it gives only one company the ability to produce a particular product because that company has that product protected. A few years ago in the pharmaceutical industry, there were a lot of articles saying that there were not enough new products coming online and that the profitability of the pharmaceutical industry was in question. Well, the pharmaceutical industry went and looked at the products they currently have. And one of these products is Carac. And I use this product on my skin. It's for precancerous skin conditions. When this product came out, it sold for $159 for this tube. $159. That seems like a lot of money. But what pharmaceutical firms have been able to figure out is that by charging $2,859 for this tube, they can increase their profits. So what we're seeing is that many products whose value is in intellectual property are being sold at astronomical prices simply because the market allows it.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you have anything to add about what problems have resulted from the economic system as it's been going?
So basically, I think the majority of people in the world are facing growing economic problems compared to 10 years ago. And so in the United States, officially, the recession ended, the Great Recession in 2009, but we're now 7 years later. And it's true that jobs, the number of jobs have been growing, but people's incomes, what's called the real wage after the small amount of inflation we had, is less than it was 7 years ago. And the official unemployment rate actually looks pretty good, like 5%, but what's not being said is how many people have given up looking for work. Mm-hmm. So we have a huge number of people, particularly among younger people, but among all age, a lot of people over 50 also, who've given up looking for work, or people who can't, women who can't file child care. So you have a lot of people who've given up looking for jobs. So I think the actual economy, in terms of meeting people's needs, is creating huge problems, plus the huge economic inequality, what's going to the top 1%, which is the highest it's been since at least the 1920s, to what the majority of the population is earning. And poverty is still officially 1 in 7 people. I would argue it's more like 1 in 4 people.
Right. So when you talk about the people who've either given up looking for work or who know not even to try because there's no jobs, those people are not calculated into the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is based on people who are, quote, in the job market?
Exactly. So to be unemployed officially, you have to be actively looking for work. If you're working 1 hour a week, you're considered to be employed. Yeah. And so I would say there is many people who are either working part-time, who want to be working full-time, or people who've given up looking for work as the official number of unemployed.
Well, and then you also have people who have skills, but they can't get work in the jobs that they're skilled at, so they're doing something that's they're house cleaning,
right?
Or they're driving a taxi, or they're something but not at their actual level of skill.
No, I think it's so sad, waste of human abilities, craze that you have a lot of people who want to be producing useful goods, who want to be productive, socially productive, not making profits, but meeting their own needs and needs of society. But because it's not profitable, they don't get hired.
Right. Traditionally, and really up to the current time, what have been the basic operational elements of capitalism, which is our current economic system? How is capitalism supposed to work traditionally?
Okay, so I think first it's important to understand that human existence goes back thousands of years, and capitalism has a relatively short existence. So I think it's something that's really for the last 400 or 500 years, and human beings can change it. I think the essence of capitalism is that production is for profit. Like people may need the cream that John shows, but if it's not profitable, they're not going to produce. You don't have the money, you can't buy it. So production is for profit, not to meet human needs. I think that's one key part of capitalism. I think a second part is most of the population does not have enough resources that they can survive by themselves. They have to work for somebody else. So I think that's a second important aspect of capitalism. I think a third important aspect is that more and more of goods, services, the air, the water, the land become commodities, meaning they're produced for exchange, not for use. So we see even today like attempts to make schools commodities, being bought and sold for profit. Many things that used to be produced in the home, for example, like food, childcare, now often becomes commodities. So I think generally things become commodities, produced for exchange rather than need, production for profit, most people being wage laborers, a small minority owning most of the wealth that they can hire other people. That's, to me, the essence of capitalism.
More recently, John, we've had this variation called neoliberalism, which is sort of a variation on what Peter's explained as how things go. Can you tell us what this concept is of neoliberalism? And it's really spread in many parts of the world now.
Well, I think that if you wanted to cast it in a good light, it was the United States saying that the rest of the world can enjoy the same things that we enjoy by adopting the kind of economy that we have, and that is a free market economy. It hasn't really worked out that way. What we're seeing is that around the world, we're seeing a lot of economic problems. I was in El Salvador 10 years ago and met with some factory workers there, and the jobs that were paying at that time $11 and $12 an hour here in the apparel industry were paying around $80 a month at the time in El Salvador. We created a free trade agreement with El Salvador, as we have tried to do with other countries, and that's given us a tremendous amount of leverage in controlling the economy.
When you say us, you're referring to the people running the U.S., not the three of us here.
Well, I'm an American, so I
we
say
benefit
us.
from it.
Yes.
We benefit from that.
Maybe.
That's
Bye-bye.
arguable, but right now in El Salvador, there's a $300 million lawsuit against the country of El Salvador for not allowing an American and Canadian gold mining company to extract gold in El Salvador. And the government is saying, we don't know what we're going to do because we've signed this free trade agreement, this neoliberal agreement, and $300 million is a huge sum for a tiny country to pay.
Yeah. So the neoliberalism has to do with this very radical free trade stuff, NAFTA, which has been in effect among Canada, U.S., and Mexico since January of '94.
Right.
The WTO, and now the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, all these kinds of things. These very radical free trade things that can cause that kind of problem that you're talking about.
Well, tremendous problems, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's even more than that. Can I add briefly?
Please.
The term neoliberalism is used a lot in other countries, not as much in the United States, and might be confusing to people because the liberal has nothing to do with like Franklin Roosevelt or the New Deal or when people
Yes.
call Obama liberal. It mainly has to do with the economy. Again, the idea of social spending, social programs are really cut back. Things that, for example, maybe that produced publicly by the government become produced for profit too. And even this term free market, I would say it's more a system that really is all about maximizing profits. You know, it often says cutting the government, but it doesn't necessarily mean cutting the police or military, because when people are having more and more difficult time, they often do rebel. And so I think the law and order, that sort of property rights, particularly property of business, at the expense of everything else, gets put at the center too. And I think we're being told, that there's no alternative to neoliberalism, but I think there is. And maybe simply, it's the movement of capital across countries, money, goods, but not people.
Right, and that's why you get this big stink in this country about immigrants crossing the border, but the money can easily flow, but the workers are held back, and it's a disconnect there. Whenever society thinks about big issues, this really creates an opportunity to explore the underlying values that should guide our decision about big issues. And people really are talking about economics these days now. And Peter, when we were planning this TV interview, you told me that we should think about democracy in all aspects of life. And I like that very much. Can you tell us about the concept of economic democracy?
Okay, well, so first, I would say our view of democracy often is very limited. It should be much more than just electing Tweedledum and Tweedledee in an election. I remember I lived in Pittsburgh before I came here. The biggest employer was U.S. Steel. In a period of 5 years, even though they were making money, they cut their employment from about 30,000 to 3,000. The workers had no say in that matter. So to me, we have a very, very restricted view of democracy in the United States. When I think of really economic democracy, in important decisions, we have control about our jobs, our communities, that those things that affect people, including the economic level, how goods are produced, what kind of technology, prices, that is decided by the people who actually involved in that themselves, not just the stockholders or the top management.
You didn't get a voice in how much to pay for that cream that you needed.
Correct.
It's there, and you're really at the mercy of that pharmaceutical company. In the modern era, if capitalism is one dominant model that we're very familiar with, the other dominant model seems to be socialism. But I think a lot of people don't understand socialism. Peter, could you lay out the basic concept of what socialism is, recognizing that there are a lot of variations that we'll talk about later?
Okay, so I was saying, just like there's many varieties of capitalism, I think all unequal, but some, like neoliberal that John was talking about, are more unequal. There's many debate, lack of clarity about socialism. I would say maybe central to socialism is that production is organized to meet human needs, not to meet profits. That would be number one. Number two, I would say, at both the level of the workplace and society as a whole, there's what I would call like self-management democracy, the term we were using earlier, that people are really controlling what they're producing. Moreover, the productive wealth, things that produce money, would not be privately owned, but be owned community or socially owned. So I would say, just to give a short example, of course people could own their own house or their toothbrush or their car in socialism. That's personal property, but maybe you couldn't make money by just owning property and renting it out. So you couldn't maybe be a landlord. You could certainly have your own house and so on. So the idea that having money to make money, I think, is not what socialism is. It's more that people make money by producing, meeting the needs of the community themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so what I'm gaining from that is that the decisions about what to produce and how to produce it are rooted more in the community and in the workforce, rather than in a boss who might not even live there and doesn't have to breathe the polluted air, whereas the people in the community, if they were in a decision-making role, would choose not to pollute the air. They'd find clean ways to do it.
So I think that's really good. I would say, I call it participatory planning, not central planning, because you could also have like some systems where a few planners make the decisions also, but participatory planning, where there's a back and forth between needs of individuals and communities and workers in different workplaces, together developing a feasible plan, decide what should be produced, how it should be produced, what kind of incomes and so on.
So, and there probably have been occasions where people have actually done that. We have the bad example of like Stalin, doing this very, very top-down oppressive thing. But what you're talking about is not at all oppressive. It sounds very liberating and empowering.
I think it's very possible. The critique of what I'm saying is that people say, sure, it works on a small community, but could it work on a larger level? I think there's some examples, for example, in certain areas around Barcelona in the 1930s, during the fight against Franco, when they were trying to survive. There's some really interesting examples going on in a place called Rojava now in northern Syria. So I think the examples where you really have this kind of, would say, democracy at all levels, I think we've seen aspects of it in other societies, but fully blown socialist societies, I do think theoretically are possible. I think they're not great examples, but I think many things you could have said, let's end slavery in the United States in 1850. People said, that's a pipe dream. So I think it's worth working for an alternative and to think of ways, practically and theoretically, we could get there.
Yeah, and we'll do a little bit more of that. And that's the fun part, is if we have things that affect us where we play with the experimentation and what are our values and how do we move there. John, I want to follow up with you. Within socialism, a dominant value has been empowering workers and local communities to make decisions, as Peter has been saying. Tell us about cooperatives, because there are cooperatives where folks are doing this.
Well, I think that there's a tremendous interest in cooperatives right now, and part of it is a reaction to the experience with looking to government and the state to create economic solutions. And the problem with government is the nature of bureaucracies are top-down. The decisions are made at the top and they work their way down to the local level. And cooperatives in different types of community organizations are looking to organizations that start from the bottom and work their way up and grow from maybe a very small group of people to much larger groups. And I think that in Venezuela, we've had the exchange with the Seco Se Sola cooperative where, for example, the Olympia Food Co-op has sent workers to Venezuela, and we've had Venezuelan workers on 2 occasions now come and work here in our own community. They're a cooperative which started with paying for a funeral and has worked into over 1,000 members. And they seem to be surviving the economic chaos in Venezuela very well right now.
Yeah. What kinds of economic activities is this cooperative doing?
Well, it ranges from agriculture, farming, to a hospital, to grocery sales, to hard goods, furniture, various things.
So what would be the difference? Suppose we were to have more cooperatives in the United States. What would be the benefits either to the individual workers or to local communities?
Well, if there's an acid test that I use, and I would say the same for socialism, is who's responsible for the economic activities that you're engaged in. Are you responsible? Are we responsible? Or do we look to some corporation or some financial group? I think cooperatives look to themselves. And so here in Olympia, we have the Olympia Food Co-op, but we've created an organization called CoSound, which is made up of various small cooperatives here in the Olympia community. A lot of it has been influenced by Seco Se Sola. I visited a similar organization in El Salvador last February. But the idea is that you start small and you build and you create a network. And so it's taking responsibility for your economic activity and taking whatever proceeds come from that activity and putting it back into the community. So you're not extracting wealth from a community, you're managing it within the community.
Right, because that's what happens with these big businesses is, well, like here in Thurston County, our electric utility is Puget Sound Energy, but it's no longer owned by stockholders in the region. It's owned by a giant corporation based in Australia with a lot of Australian investors and people elsewhere, and there's no empowerment at all. And so what you're talking about, when you talk about responsibility at the local level, you're talking really about empowerment.
Right.
And who calls the shots.
Yeah, if we look at major corporations, they want to get as far away from their workers as possible so that they can make decisions based on their global interests rather than the interests of their workers. So Boeing moves their headquarters to Chicago.
Right.
General Electric moves their headquarters to Boston. We're seeing large corporations disassociating themselves from their workers. On a local level, we have to build economic organizations that are loyal to and centered on the community and the workers that are participating.
And it just popped into my head in the old Charles Dickens A Christmas Carol. Scrooge actually interacted with Bob Cratchit and the family
Absolutely.
and Tiny Tim, and he had to deal with the reality of the oppressed worker, if you want to think that way. And if you're an absentee owner, it's quite different. We're kind of playing with the notion of socialism, and in this country, I think a lot of people think of that as somehow a foreign concept. It's like a European thing, but it's not a real American thing. And you folks and I, in talking about this in preparing for the program, shared some examples that we have some elements of socialism in our society now. The U.S. Constitution says the federal government has to provide post offices, and we have socialized fire departments, police departments. You know, if my house catches fire, I don't look in the phone book in the yellow pages, call 3 vendors and ask for a low bid to come out and put out the fire. My taxes have already covered that. We have the fire department. We have libraries. The streets are publicly owned. In many communities, water and sewer utilities are publicly owned and so forth. Our taxes pay for this, and then we elect the people who manage that.
So socialism, or the idea in this country, came out of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of the thinking was modeled after what you were talking about. And that is, we created a political democracy that took care of the legal system, defense, these sorts of things, at a time in which our economy was primarily agricultural and small scale.
And decentralized.
And decentralized.
And we can do things either in a decentralized or centralized way. And Peter, a few minutes ago, was telling about and you were saying also about the perils of doing it in a top-down way. Right. But decentralized things can work.
Yeah, even though, so trying to deal with a few things that the two of you have been saying. So in terms of thinking of some of the examples you have, like let's say Puget Sound Energy, to me, whether it's US owned or Australian, to me doesn't matter. It's still about profits. And, and even if it was a public company, most studies I've looked at, when energy is provided by public companies rather than private, prices are a little bit better, quality is a little bit better from looking at across the country. So that's a step forward. To me, a much bigger step forward would be if it was not only publicly owned, but also where the workers had a lot of control of how it was run, would have some say in either not having manager, picking the managers, having a much smaller salary scale than the huge salary scales we see here. So to me, having things publicly owned is positive. Now, I think the cooperatives that John's been talking about, I do see as really positive, that you can see things not just being run for profit in a much more kind of horizontal democratic way. On the other hand, I think unless we have all societal change they're still limited. I think there's important examples, but some cooperatives, people, because they're in certain sectors, they'll be let's say architects form a cooperative, they'll be making far more money than farm workers or people in a restaurant do. And to me, that's still unjust. And you're still competing against these big companies. By having cooperatives, it doesn't stop the Monsantos or the US military being all over the world. And so I do think they're really important as examples. I think we need change at that level, but we also must think about societal change. If we're really talking about a society that really is sustainable, meeting needs, equal, practice self-management, it's sustainable, and so on too.
Yeah, I agree. And if we can experiment with and lift up these alternatives like cooperatives and things, it's a way of practicing democracy that people can say, well, gee, if we can do this in this way, how about if we do this in some other sector too? So instead of having these global corporations, we do things different. Instead of having a top-down, energy-intensive agriculture system, what if we find ways to support small farmers again? And I mean, whenever we have a good example, it provides leverage, which is partly why the United States government tries to beat up on good examples that happen in other countries like Cuba or Nicaragua with the Sandinistas,
I've been to
or Venezuela more recently.
Yeah, I think one thing, listening to Pete, is the idea that cooperatives can be just a different form of capitalist organization. One of the things that our visitors from Seco Se Sola from Venezuela emphasized was that there has to be a culture change as well.
Yeah.
And cooperatives are conducive to that type of change in perspective.
Yeah, I guess that's the kind of thing I was trying to get at with this most recent thing. It's a way of getting leverage. You get your foot in the door somehow and play with some leverage, and people can see possibilities that they could not have seen before. I want to take things from another way, looking at it from the other side. And so instead of privatizing public resources, there's been this big right-wing mania to privatize things that are publicly owned. I'd like to see some things that are currently private become socialized. For example, there's for 100 years now in North Dakota, there's been a publicly owned bank that the state government has, and they've used the money to keep it in the state rather than send it off to Wall Street, and do it for good things like student loans at low interest rates and small business and so forth. And there's an effort now to have city-owned banks in Seattle. There's a movement coming up to have postal banking, which used to happen through post office, where you could have a savings account there and not be at the mercy of commercial banks or payday lenders. Does anybody have insights or about other things where there are privately owned things that would actually be more democratically run if they were grounded in a...
Well, one of the things certainly is our local credit unions, and they are owned by the membership. And we've had events, Co-opatopia is one of the events that we've had here in Olympia, in which local cooperatives have worked together. However, a simple thing like financing a cooperative is something that is impossible at this particular point, because lending institutions will say, the credit unions will say that we don't have any experience in that. So other states, New Mexico for one, there have been programs that have been created with local credit unions to create financing for cooperative projects. And that's one thing that we'd like to work on.
So just to add to that, I know in the 2007, 2008, 2009, I gave a lot of talks about the Great Recession that you were talking about at the beginning of the show, Glenn. And the discussion came up often, should the banks be taken over? And I would say yes, but if the banks are taken over, even corporations like General Motors, because for a while they were kind of government owned,
Right.
if they're still about making profits, it's not really any different. So I would argue the banks should be taken over, but then the criterion should not be making money, but for example, funding cooperatives, funding local employment, funding racial equality, gender equality. And so that probably means using taxes from high-income people to fund that, where the goal is no longer profit, but really creating decent jobs, challenging so many of the inequalities in society.
Yeah.
When you say what should be public, I was almost thinking what shouldn't be. I mean, think of childcare, for example. If you do the math, it's impossible to have affordable childcare, quality childcare, meaning a small number of kids per a teacher, and the teacher's getting a decent, a livable wage. If you add those three together, it's impossible.
Right.
And so childcare is so obviously something that should be publicly run with a lot of control by the parents and the teachers, and be publicly funded too, because you just cannot run it for profit. Even a nonprofit, given the economic inequality, most people cannot afford quality childcare. So they should be like the schools, you know. Again, so I think what shouldn't be publicly run, you know, the idea of the commons, of things are a commonwealth, like TCTV. Why shouldn't it be all of TV and so on, be not run for profit? So I'm thinking what shouldn't be, you know, is the way I think about it.
And this is the kind of fun thing to play with, you know. There's so many things, like at the beginning of the interview, when you're talking about, instead of having an economic system that all is focused on just profit, it should be focused on meeting people's needs, you know. And if we started with that as the starting point, that and democracy, then it asks that question that you raised now about what shouldn't be publicly handled. I think that would be a fun thing to play with. I want to see if we can deal with this concept of free markets, which is so pervasive in our society. People just assume that free markets, that's what we have to have. And I don't even think that we have free markets. That's another question. But what do you think, John, about the concept of free market, and is that even realistic?
Well, I don't think it's realistic. And I think that we're sort of fed the idea of a free market, and then we look at these giant global corporations and we say, well, this is the free market, when in fact they're monopolies.
Right.
And they're not monopolies that are highly creative. If you look at the major corporations, you'll find that most of their expansion comes through acquisition. In fact, I said earlier that General Electric was moving to Boston, getting away from their employees, but they also said the reason they were moving to Boston was that there were a lot of startups and venture capital situations. And it's because the ideas that are fueling these large corporations are very often coming from very small entities. And when we talk about cooperatives and how small they are, and they're very small entities, I would remind you that most things develop from something that's very small. And even these giant corporations, their major innovations is through acquisition.
Yeah.
So I think that there's lots of directions that we can look at.
Yeah. In the United States, we run our elections based on money, and I think that the free market model of buying politicians, if you're a billionaire and you can afford to buy politicians, that's a very corrupt way to do things. There are a lot of things where the markets are just not suited to what the real need is.
But even if it's not corrupt, I think it often is. So let's say somebody, you know, society, some people have all this wealth, so the market will produce, I don't know, fur coats for people's pet chihuahuas.
Yeah.
Other people need, basic medicine to survive, but it's not,
Right.
they can't afford it. So is that the free market? Is that the kind of thing that the market, even the claims, it basically responds to a dollar a vote, not a person a vote.
Right.
So that's the essence of the free market even working. And then even if you begin with a lot of small firms, eventually some firms will maybe have lower costs, they'll have marketing advantages, they'll get big, they'll force other firms out of business, and they can charge the amount of money for the cream that John mentioned at the beginning of the show.
So they pay lip service to free markets, and they don't want free markets.
Definitely.
Because it's all about maximizing. There's a related concept to this that we've talked about on the phone preparing for this. Social democracy is a bit different. We've talked about democracy. Peter, can you give us some thoughts about the concept of social democracy?
So to me, when Bernie Sanders says he's a democratic socialist to me is something I hold up very highly. It's different from social democratic. To me, social democratic is a regulated form of capitalism. And the social part is it has some concerns for meeting human needs. There's some redistribution in social democracy of taxing the wealthy more, which is good, and using that for universal social programs. That's very, very positive. But still, to me, social democracy is where I think of Scandinavian countries, where there's higher tax on the wealthy. They're much more equal than the United States, but still most production for example, in Sweden or in Norway is done for profit by large private corporations. So to me, the idea of social democracy, you have production on a capitalist basis primarily, but then you have some redistribution to meet sort of needs that are like health care, child care that I mentioned, education. They tend to be available to the larger population. So I would say it's a kinder, gentler capitalism, but still often it's been very much focused on economic growth for its own sake, less environmental concerns, often not being concerned about what that country is doing in other places. And I think, for example, if you look at Bernie Sanders, I think a lot of his social programs are really important about dealing with inequality and corporate power. On the other hand, I wish he was a little bit more critical than he is of U.S. intervention around the world, the U.S. support for Israel, and so on, too. And he really fits into this history of social democracy that I think has a long history that is, to me, kind of, I said, not socialism, even though often the term is used. Many people who used to call themselves socialists saw that was impossible and became social democrats, particularly around about 100 years ago.
Yeah, we would all do better in our society if we had thoughtful, substantive conversations about these things and played with what are the possibilities, what are our values, how can we do things better. So I appreciate your thought on that. There actually is a history in the United States of socialism. We had a lot of grassroots organizing in the late 1800s, early 1900s for changing our economics. We actually had some socialist parties and candidates who did well running as socialists, and there's a revival of this kind of thing. So it's not just a foreign concept, but we've been playing with this here. Can you give us some information? We're a bit tight on time, but a little bit of a thing
It's written out of history, and I think it's really important we learn not just the mainstream history, but its history, what people have done. So, for example, in the early 1900s, there was a pretty strong socialist party in the United States that talked about reaching socialism, not social democracy, mainly a lot through education. For example, its most well-known person, Eugene Debs, ran for president 4 times, once while he was in prison because he opposed the U.S. in World War I, which he argued was an imperialist kind of war. And he got over 6% of the vote. They had mayors, so there was a very, very strong socialist party that really did try to combine democracy at all levels, including the economic level. So that tradition has existed. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, was also a union that was kind of combining anarchism and socialism. It's a whole other thing, anarchism, that I think was a very, very strong around World War I. It still exists today, but much smaller.
Yeah, and it had a big history in the Northwest here.
Exactly.
That's fascinating stuff. Let's see. Other nations have been experimenting at. Can you tell us something about some examples from other nations of what they've tried to do?
Well, there seems to be this view that capitalism or neoliberalism isn't working, and social democracy isn't working, that you have the problem of hierarchy and the fact that when decisions are made on one level, it isn't answering the needs of the people at the grassroots. So what we're seeing are words like solidarity economy, social economy. There's a kind of, in various parts of the world, there's a vocabulary that's being created for organizations that are starting their economic activities on a small local level, and then they're creating networks with organizations. For example, one organization I'm familiar with has members in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. In Venezuela, the cooperatives are organized into networks. The Seco Se Sola co-op I mentioned had 1,000 workers, but the network that they're involved with has 20,000 workers. So what we're seeing is organizations starting small and then networking, and as they network, grow. And by growing from the bottom up, the feeling is that they're creating more viable economic alternatives than simply having the state come in and take over an enterprise and turn it over to the people, as that has been done in Venezuela.
Yeah. There's some other kinds of interesting experimentation. I know in Porto Alegre, Brazil, for a number of years and spreading elsewhere, there's been what's referred to as participatory budgeting, where they have a process where grassroots people come together and have a grassroots democratic, small d democratic conversation about how to devise their municipal budget or regional budget. And that's a way of doing some economic democracy bottom up, and that's been, they've been able to meet the community needs.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. So I think one thing that people in power in the United States, both people who control the major media, the government, large corporations, is this view there's really no alternative to capitalism.
That's what they keep telling us.
And people call it Tina, and so I really think, hopefully from the show, really looking for alternatives. And so that's been a lot of my life, has been, for example, visiting countries or seeing some alternatives. And one difficulty I feel, besides what John is saying, is that the United States has really tried to destroy alternatives. Like, I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua in the 80s when I think there were some really exciting alternatives going on. And the United States, unfortunately, conducted a war on particularly Ronald Reagan to prevent any alternative from happening. Right. And even in Cuba, which I think certainly is a very imperfect society, I wouldn't call it socialist, but I've been there many, many times. And it's impressive. You go in the smallest community and there's free dental care. Because again, health care, dental care is seen as a basic need. Can you imagine in the United States how many people don't have dental care? The same with education. You get paid a little bit if you go to the university there. They have a huge population going there. So like I've been to like Nicaragua, Venezuela. You know, the participatory budget that you mentioned in Brazil, Venezuela also has that communal councils in many parts of Venezuela too. So again, John and I have both been to Venezuela quite a few times. There's many problems there, some caused by the United States, some not. But there are these attempts to really have local people become what I call subject of history, to decide how the money should be spent, not just the national government, what to go for, like community projects, employment, which is such a major issue, both in Venezuela and here, providing real meaningful jobs that meet real needs.
Yeah, yeah. We're tight on time, but I want us to think just a bit about. Some people say, well, let's just reform capitalism a bit, find ways to reform it, and other people say we need to ditch it and do something quite different. or I mean, and how do you get from here to there? You know, I mean, these are big issues.
Right.
We would need a whole program on a full hour on just that. But I wonder if you just tease out some dimensions of this, either you, John, let's start with you.
Well, I think a huge issue is building capacity. I think that socialists in the past have said, well, you know, we'll elect a socialist president and we'll have socialism. But in fact, how do we develop within ourselves the ability to manage an economy? And I may have my suit on now, but I spent today with the Northwest Construction Cooperative, which was putting on a torch-down roof on a 7,000 square foot building. So,
That's a worker cooperative, is it?
yes, it's one of the businesses that's in our co-sound group, along with the Olympia Food Co-op and the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. So I think learning how to do something differently and having the capability to do it is the biggest challenge. Taking responsibility for your economic activities.
I want to raise another angle that we haven't talked about much, and a lot of people who see modern capitalism as fundamentally unfair, unjust, also see capitalism as hurting the environment and the climate and being just horribly unsustainable, because we have a world of finite resources, but an economic system that is committed to endless growth, and that just doesn't work. So people who want a better economic system that, besides being socially just, economically just, is also sustainable and takes care of the environment, what kind of economics would support sustainability and environmental care?
So can I start on that one? Okay. So I think under capitalism, basically, destruction of the environment is almost intrinsic. You can do regulations like things like the EPA, which I think are very valuable, but I think you're always swimming upstream because businesses are always going to try to minimize their costs and put their social costs like pollution onto everybody else. That's how they can make more profits. Look at mining, you know, you mentioned mining El Salvador. It's also a question of mining going on right here. Who's paying the cost for the mining? The workers in the communities. To me, in a society that's a socialist society, a democratic or participatory socialist society, it doesn't guarantee that species, human beings, we can all live in harmony with each other, but it creates the possibility, if you make the planning saying that's a central value is sustainability of all species, including human beings, but not just human beings, I think you have the possibility of dealing with issues like climate change, acid rain, destruction of various kind of species. So I think it creates the possibility of really dealing in a serious way with the environment rather than throwing its word around sustainability like Weyerhaeuser does, which to me is just, you know, words.
That's their public relations thing. Yeah, I mean, if the local community were making the decisions, if we were empowered, we would not have a local worker-owned, community-owned business damaging our own ecosystem.
Correct, but
because
I think,
it's local and we have better sense in that. But if you have absentee landlords, what do they care?
So I think that's really important, but I think you also need some kind of global coordination. I think of climate change. I think the local is really important, right? If, you know, people who own the coal mines had to live there, they may think a little bit different about at least some aspects of it. But I think you also need on a larger level. That's why I'm stressing both the local but also the larger, because I think a lot of these issues are really global issues, like the oceans.
Yeah. What kind of experimentation and innovation would you like to see? Because if we're going to get from here to there, we got to play with ideas like we've been doing. You know, say, well, this is possible. This is possible. Are there some new ways of doing things that you think would be steps on the way?
I think that if I were to speak for socialists, I would say socialists should create their own agenda. That much of what progressives have done is simply react to issues that have been raised, and the way the reaction has been formatted by the people who are in power. An example being income. We talk about inequality, economic inequality, and our statistics are about income. Most wealth is created without any income at all. It's been the appreciation of stock, it's been financial transactions which are untaxed. We talk about conservation, and yet we tax used merchandise because we want people to buy new merchandise. So we tax things over and over again as they're repaired or conserved. In fact, the word conservation is no longer in our vocabulary. We talk about recycling, or we have some other word. So we're conditioned to think in a way that accelerates consumption. And we have to step back and look at the world we're living in and really envision an alternative.
So a few things, and you're right, this could be a long discussion too. I want to introduce an idea. We talked about socialism, the idea of non-reformist reforms. The idea of non-reformist reforms. You asked Glenn about reforms earlier. To me, the idea of non-reformist reforms are reforms that you deal with people's needs, but also show the limits under capitalist society. Build the capacity John talked about and want to go beyond the system. So, for example, like maybe pushing for free bus service for everybody. The idea of making things non-commodities, community, socialized, controlled healthcare, where maybe the money comes to federal government, but then be run a lot at a local level too. So some of these ideas are reforms, but they also move beyond that. I think also the idea of bringing movements together. We haven't talked much about racism, oppression of women, but I think those are so tied to capitalism too. So building movements that connect different movements with a vision of a different society, not just small change, but a vision that really could provide meaningful jobs, sustainable environment, where a lot of these isms really can become things of the past, where equality is real. It doesn't mean the equality of a few people become billionaires by winning some lottery or something.
Yeah. So there are things. I mean, these are some kind of bold visions, but there are things that are like you said, free bus service.
Right.
That's not that far out.
Right.
That's something we could do, and there are other things that we could do. And I keep thinking of any of these things that provide some leverage, so it opens up our thinking. Oh, this is possible. I never would have thought that that's possible, and now we have it.
Free college education.
Yeah, that's being talked about all of a sudden, and everybody's talking about it.
Bernie Sanders is.
Yeah. We can make progress only if we create a much wider range of choices, if we envision more things as being possible, if we ground our creativity in our best values and then build that. We experience all kinds of unfairness and craziness in our economic lives, and there's got to be a better way, and I appreciate Peter and John in helping us explore these better ways. So we can create an economic system. I'd like to see one that is profoundly nonviolent instead of the violence inherent in our current system. One that respects human dignity and human rights. One that respects the environment and the climate and sustainability. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093. Visit the website www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you uniquely have to offer. Thanks.